Let's talk about these developments with our opening panel. Joining us now is former CIA officer Mike Baker. All right, Mike, let's start with you. The regime is under a lot of pressure, clearly. So we get these reports that Tehran may be planning an attack. As our producer here on Clearcut likes to say, Iran is like a wounded animal, so perhaps more dangerous than usual. What's your read on this?
Well, this is not uncommon for them in terms of sort of their bellicose actions when they lash out. As you said, a bit of a wounded animal there, and so their tendency is to push back. I wouldn't read too much into sort of their recent bellicose comments from the Revolutionary Guard Corps, but I do think that what we're seeing is a direct reaction to the sanctions that have been imposed on them, and their concern, meaning the regime's concern of losing power. That is the only thing, frankly, that motivates them. And so the idea that perhaps these growing protests inside Iran, and then also this pushback, very interesting pushback that we're seeing against Iran inside of Iraq and in the Lebanon, I think really has them on their back foot. It would be wrong to take them up on their offer to relieve sanctions in exchange for talks. The only reason they signed that deal in 2015 was because the previous administration here in the U.S. agreed to lift sanctions, agreed to give them money, their frozen assets, and agreed to some fairly ridiculous terms within that agreement, meaning we had no transparency within their military facilities in Iran to inspect and verify this idea that they were no longer pursuing a nuclear weapon.
And Mike, that's really one of the main reasons why President Trump pulled out of that Iran deal, because it was so fatally flawed on a number of reasons, including the ones you've mentioned, including the ones that gave the Iranian regime a lot of the economic benefits up front. So clearly this notion that the U.S. is going to return to the negotiating table with the regime in Tehran, if it lifts the sanctions first, is not going to happen. I want to bring Kamran Bokhari into the conversation. He's the founding director at the Center for Global Policy. So, Kamran, as we've been discussing, Tehran is clearly on the ropes. A number of protests against Iranian assets in a number of regions, including Lebanon and Iraq, and of course those protests back home. And now we have these reports of a potential imminent Iranian attack on U.S. targets. What do you make of it?
Well, I think that the Iranians would be foolish to go on the offensive and stage a first strike on U.S. Military bases or U.S. assets or U.S. interests, because the response is going to be overwhelming. And I don't think that they're foolish to do that. I think that this is a lot of this is posturing. A lot of this is also a response to the pressure that the Iranians are feeling, both from the sanctions and the protests at home and in Iraq and in Lebanon. And so, obviously, they will strike somewhere. We've seen them strike against Saudi Arabia in very recently with the attack on the oil facilities. They may do something like that, but I don't think that they would attack the United States, before they, at least not in sort of an offensive way, because they know that the response is going to be overwhelming.
Have criticized the United States for not retaliating on the downing of the U.S. drone, and also for not retaliating for those attacks on the Saudi pipelines that Kamran just referenced. Of course, you could argue that this is what the regime wants. It wants to pull the U.S. into some kind of military confrontation. Has that been the right approach so far, to not take the bait?
I'm sorry, for which of us are you asking?
Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, sure. No, I think there's an argument you could make that says they've been somewhat emboldened by the lack of substantive response to particularly the strike in Saudi on the oil fields. Look, that took down half their production capability, and there was precious little in the way of response. And the question of the attack from inside of Syria on Israel, yeah, you could make the argument that a stronger response might keep them in check. I do think that the concern here is what is a proportional, appropriate response in these situations. And there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that the general public's not aware of in terms of a counterstrike or an attack that may take place. I agree that I don't think we're going to see them lash out first. And I do think unless of course, again, unless they feel as if they're completely on their back foot and they're about to lose power.
All right. Mike and Kamran, stick around. We'll continue this conversation on the other side of the break. We'll also discuss the president and the NATO summit. He's left London, but did he leave a bit early because other world leaders were caught mocking him? We'll have the latest. Also, Congress making a near unanimous move to punish China for its mass detention of Chinese Muslims.
We're on the inside of political and religious passions in Jerusalem.
Breaking down the financial trends shaping the global economy.
Giving you key context, not just headlines.
With the stories from Israel that touch the U.S.
and those across this region with impact far beyond its borders.
Weekdays at 1 p.m. Eastern.
Join us on The Rundown, where the Middle East meets the world.
Brace yourself for your daily dose of news. I'm Jeff Smith. Join me every day for a fast-paced breakdown of major international stories with an emphasis on live reporting. An analysis of news you need to know. We'll track the headlines quickly, expertly, in a dose you can handle.
You're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
One of the key issues in this election is women's rights.
Sometimes the best gifts come in the ugliest packages.
You don't grow without dips and valleys. If it's always like that, then how do you ever learn?
Well, I think the world has changed. Israel's going to have that leading edge.
You're watching Clear Cut. Welcome back. I'm Michelle McCory. This is yet another story to update you on tonight on the Iran front. Arabic news sources are reporting that a major airstrike has been carried out tonight against a large Iranian Revolutionary Guard weapons warehouse on the Syrian-Iraqi border. Unidentified aircraft fired missiles at targets located at the warehouse near the Al Hamdan airport. That's just outside of the city of Deir ez-Zor. Now, this comes 2 weeks after Israel struck several Iranian targets inside Syria, killing 16 Iranian fighters. Experts believe that Israel and the U.S. have been hitting Iranian weapon depots throughout Iraq for the last few months. Let's bring back our panel, former CIA officer Mike Baker and Kamran Bokhari from the Center for Global Policy. Kamran, we know that Secretary of State Pompeo met with Netanyahu in Lisbon today. What level of coordination do you think there is right now between Israel and the U.S. regarding Iran?
I think that the United States is comfortable in letting Israel take the lead in the airstrikes against Iranian assets inside Syria and even Lebanon from time to time, as and when needed. But I think that beyond that, I think that the United States is a bit concerned that, what kind of response are the Iranians going to do if there's an escalation? So as far as Iraq is concerned, and there have been reports that, Israeli aircraft have hit Iranian military sites inside Iraq as well, supporting Shiite militias. So I think that this meeting was mostly about how to move forward, both strategically and tactically, in the wake of the fact that we now have protests in Iran, we have protests in Lebanon and Iraq.
Mike, there's some discussion of an Israeli-American defense pact. If that happens, what would you expect there?
Well, I agree with Cameron that, the U.S. administration would allow or would let or would be happy to have Israel take the lead in the initial action, and then we would backfill. We would come in. There's no way we would not support something should the situation escalate. But that is the problem, and the problem is what is proportionate. How do you respond without creating a firestorm in the Middle East? Look, at the end of the day, I think everybody, here in the U.S., regardless of where they are on the political spectrum, can agree, or at least would acknowledge, that Iran is experiencing sort of more influence in the region than they have in modern times, and they're going to be very loath to give that up. But this is something they haven't faced before. This pushback in Iraq, this pushback in the Lebanon. We're getting into new territory here, so there's some unknowns that we can't game out.
And while we're speaking, Mike, we're showing video of the protests in Iran itself. As we know, there have been about at least 200 or so protesters killed by Iranian forces. All this comes, Kamran, as Iran is trying to send a very strong message. We have Iran's Navy confirming that Iran will be holding joint naval drills with China and Russia starting December 27th. What are they trying to signal here with these joint naval drills, Kamran?
I think, Michelle, that they're trying to signal that they have options, that they're not without allies, and, getting the Chinese and the Russians, to the extent that this is true, that it's going to happen sometime soon, and to the extent to which it will happen in terms of scope and scale, that's what the message that they're sending, in the hope that the United States will think, before escalating. In the end, Michelle, the Trump administration is not interested in waging war, and neither are the Iranians, given their weak situation, interested in fighting the United States. This is, putting pressure on the other side to see who blinks first. In the end, President Trump wants to have a foreign policy victory ahead of the 2020 election, and the Iranians are really, really suffering in terms of their financial situation, and they're being hit from all sides. So both sides have an interest in a negotiated settlement, but no one comes to the table with a weak hand, and I think both sides are trying to have the best possible leverage that they can before they agree. And I think that all of this military activity, all of this, these psyops that are happening are part of that effort.
Part of that posturing. All right, and saber rattling, if you will. Kamran, thank you so much. Kamran Bokhari, Mike Baker, appreciate your perspective and analysis.